I just if that's okay.
Fine. Not a problem at all. All right, I'll give you introduction. I got to tell them about the tornado drill and then. Good morning. Statewide tornado drill at 10 this morning. Welcome to our March Life Enrichment. First, an announcement. There is a statewide tornado drill at 10 a.m. this morning. We will not leave this room, but if we needed to, we do have a basement in this building, and we could access it with the elevator or the stairs. So at 10 o'clock, when you hear it, it's just a drill, and we are not going to evacuate at this time. So, all right, our first speaker this morning is Joe Stump. He is an author of a book called Iconic Eats of Wichita, and another book too, right, Joe? Wicked Wichita. He came and spoke to us about that one earlier, and he's also the editor of Active Age. So please welcome Joe Stump.
Good morning. Thanks for having me as your guest. I'm sorry I probably missed the tornado drill. I got to leave after my talk, but hope you all do good at it. Again, thanks for having me. I am going to talk a little bit about the Active Age newspaper and a little bit about my most recent book, Iconic Eats of Wichita. So I passed out a few copies of the newspaper here, and just to give you a little background on the Active Age, it was started 43 years ago on the campus of Wichita State. It was kind of a project of their gerontology department, and then it's spent 10 years there. Then it went to Friends University for 10 years. And for the last 23 years, it's been a standalone nonprofit. We have our offices over on West Street, West and Maple in West Wichita. And we go out to about 54,000 subscribers every month, which makes us the biggest print paper in the state of Kansas right now. My wife works for the Wichita Eagle. I like to remind her of that. And we really do appreciate our readers. We have about, the majority of them are in Wichita and Sedgwick County, but I think we have about 4,200 subscribers in Butler County and about 2,300 in Harvey County. Those are the other two counties we serve. And we have a couple, since we're a nonprofit, we have a board of directors, and two of our directors are from here. One is Tia Tan, who also runs the Historical Museum here in El Dorado. And the other one's Mary Corrigan, who teaches at Butler Community College. So the newspaper comes out once a month, and we try to make it kind of a mix of entertaining news and features and some advocacy. It's been kind of an eye-opening experience for me. I took over from a good friend of mine about 4 years ago there, and being only 61 years old, I had not given senior issues much thought till then. But it's been a really eye-opening experience. I found out that in public affairs, I feel like the concerns of older residents a lot of times are not given much consideration. The focus is usually on, I would say, the people in their middle years and the youth, which of course are important, the future. But the people that have been around for a long time, worked all their lives, paid their taxes, owned their homes and stuff, a lot of time don't get a lot of consideration in public affairs when it comes to stuff like health care, property taxes, senior transportation issues. So we also try to advocate a little bit for that in those areas. But mainly we just try to be a interesting read, something that people can look forward to receiving every month. And it is a free newspaper, and I brought some sign-up sheets over there. If you don't receive it, we'd be happy to send it to you. And or if you have a neighbor or family member who doesn't, please sign them up and we'll put them on our subscription list. So, and I'll answer any questions about, the final thing I'd say about that is we're always looking for story ideas. So if there's anything interesting happening out here, if your club or organization has an event coming up, we're happy to publicize it, that kind of thing. Just give us a call at the newspaper or shoot me an email and we'll get it in there. And I also have a couple copies of this over there, which are free, which is kind of a resource guide. It's got a ton of phone numbers and email addresses for websites of organizations that serve older residents. So this book here is my second book, Iconic Eats of Wichita. The first one I did was called Wicked Wichita, and it's more or less I'll give a little background. I've spent a really long time in the journalism business, longer than I ever thought I would. But my first about 20 years or 25 years, I worked in Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma, and I was on the news side of the news business, meaning I covered stuff like courts and crime, politics, that kind of thing. And in that business, it's a very interesting business. You know, you're constantly meeting people, trying to learn about things, and very challenging mentally. But you never really get to know the people you are covering very well, because to some extent, there's a little bit of an antagonistic relationship. You're supposed to remain objective about the people you're writing about and not really become too friendly with them and so on. So I'd lived in those communities, Tulsa, Texarkana, and Little Rock for quite a while, but I never really felt like I always felt like a little bit of an outsider or observer. And then that changed completely when I moved to Wichita to become the Eagle's food editor in 2000. I finally was able to talk to people about things that they really enjoyed, which was food and drink. And it was a big change for me, and a welcome one. I finally felt like I was part of the community, and I did have some concerns when I took the job as food editor at the Eagle. I was thinking, would a city in the middle of the country really have much in the way of variety of food? And I was happy to find out that actually Wichita has quite a eclectic food scene due to its history of various immigrants that have moved there. Of course, it has great all-American food as well, but one thing I found out was that it has really three great strains of ethnic food, and that would be Mexican food, Vietnamese food, and Lebanese food. And the reasons are like historical reasons. The Mexicans and Hispanics have been in Wichita since before it was even a city. They were part of the cattle drives that drove the cattle up the Chisholm Trail, and many stayed around to work in the meat packing plants and settle in the city's north end. So Wichita has a really big Hispanic population, probably around 15 or 16% now, as I suspect El Dorado probably does too. And so we have a ton of great Mexican restaurants. And in the last 20 to 30 years, it's changed from previously most of the Hispanics in Wichita came from the northern part of Mexico along the border area. But in the past 20 and 30 years, there's been a lot of immigration from really all over Mexico. And Mexico, as you know, is a huge country. The food is very diverse there. You have a lot of seafood, a lot of people think in terms of corn tortillas. It's kind of like Italy. In Italy, you either have pasta or you have polenta. And it's kind of the same in Mexico. You either have flour tortillas or corn tortillas. Wichita now has a ton of Mexican restaurants from all over the country. The other two strains are, there's also been Lebanese and Mexican in Wichita since very early, since the late 1800s. Most of them came over as a lot of them were in the peddling business, and they would take horse-drawn wagons and carriages and go around the countryside and sell pots and pans, bedding, clothes out of the backs of their wagons. When they gathered enough money together to buy a brick and mortar store, they established businesses in Wichita, and a lot of them went into the food business. Quite a few of them there's some really well-known names like the Farahas, and they went into the wholesale grocery business, or like the Stevens family, they started various restaurants. And they remain very prominent in the city's business scene today, and extremely prominent in like our fine dining scene in Wichita, which I would say that about 50 to 75% of what's considered the finest restaurants in Wichita are owned by people of Lebanese descent. And that's places that don't really even specialize in Middle Eastern food. It's like Chester's Chop House or Yaya's Scotch and Sirloin. Those are owned by all people who either immigrated from Lebanon or their families did. And so they just kind of specialize in and they make a lot of money at it. So I guess that's why they do it. And the third great strain of ethnic food that we have in Wichita arrived a lot more recently, and that's Vietnamese food. And that happened because when the South Vietnam fell to the communists in the late 70s, quite a few, I guess 2 or 3 big churches in Wichita sponsored about 1,000 South Vietnamese to immigrate to Wichita. They, in turn, brought their relatives and friends over. And today, the Vietnamese constitute about 3 to 4% of the city's population. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's actually about 5 times more than would be a typical average across the United States. So for that reason, they're also quite industrious, entrepreneur-minded people, and they've established a lot of grocery stores and good Vietnamese restaurants in Wichita. And I feel like I've traveled, when I do travel, I make it a big point to eat out and test the local food. And I've been to many bigger cities, and I've really yet to find any place with better Vietnamese food than Wichita. I'm not sure even a lot of the residents realize it, but it's true. So there are long chapters in my book about those three, and recipes in my book about those types of food. And I'll just mention a few other things in the book. I start off with a little history of the of cooking in Wichita, and it's kind of interesting. Is anybody here familiar with the Campbell Castle in Wichita, also known as the Riverside Castle? That's right. It's a really grand old house on the building on the river. And way back in the 1800s, some ladies there used to meet there, and they had a group called the Thursday Afternoon Cooking Club, and they met twice a month. And this club today is the oldest recipe. It's still going on. They only meet now every other month, but it's the oldest cooking club of its kind in the United States. So I thought that was kind of a fascinating angle. I also talk about when I was at the Eagle, I was the Eagle's food editor for about 10 years, and there was one recipe that I got more requests for than any other one. And can anybody guess what that might be? Is garlic salad. Have you all had garlic salad? So I never had it before I moved to Wichita, and I still don't know quite what to make of it or why it's so popular, but it is for some reason. And it's not a salad, what you think of in the traditional sense. It's more of a chopped up lettuce and cabbage mixed with a whole lot of mayonnaise and a whole lot of garlic salt, and then you eat it on Ritz crackers. Anyway, it was wildly popular at a couple of restaurants there that are now out of business. Doc's Steakhouse on Broadway, Abe's Steakhouse in North Wichita. And so I tracked down the original recipe for that, and that recipe's in here. I've also got a ton of recipes in here from home cooks. I've met a lot of great home cooks. I think in a lot of cases they are as probably good or better than the professional cooks I met, but they just don't want to do it for a living because cooking for a living is pretty hard work. And then I've got a ton of restaurant recipes from restaurants around Wichita, including old standards like I'm trying to think of Angelo's Pizza Restaurant. One of the original recipes for sauce from the Pizza Hut in Wichita. And then I've got prize-winning recipes in there from people who entered contests. And I've got kind of my afterword is a sort of a tongue-in-cheek section about what I think the city of Wichita should really do is capitalize on its history as a center of fast food in the United States. I don't know if a lot of you know this, but the first hamburger chain started in Wichita. That's White Castle. We don't have one now, but it's considered the first of the real hamburger chains. And then, of course, Pizza Hut started there and was headquartered there for many years. So I think the city would be well served to build a national or international fast food hall of fame on the riverfront. They could have a food court there. I mean, the most massive food court in the country. I think it would draw all kind of people. But anytime I mention that, most times people just laugh about it. But I am dead serious about it. So that's a little bit about what's in the book and in the Active Age newspaper. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about the food scene in Wichita, about the Active Age newspaper or anything like that, if you all got any questions. Yes, sir. Yes. Beacon? The beacon is still there, yeah. Yeah, the Eagle has moved, and they tore down the building, and the Cargill now has its headquarters there, a real nice headquarters. But the Beacon restaurant's still there. Yep, still serving the same menu as far as I know. Yes. I think it's because, interesting, my wife wrote that article in the Eagle, if you read it. And I think it's a combination of the competition, probably some changing customer taste, and also the family. It's like maybe now the second or third generation that took it over, and they have some other businesses that I think they're more interested in operating. They just really want to keep the two busiest ones open and phase out or I guess they're maybe already closed the other ones or fixing to. But are you a New Way fan? Well, you'll still be able to get your fix on. I know the one they say they're never going to close the one on Douglas and Delano, at least the original one. The other ones I'm not. The other one I'm not sure about. And just eating research. Yeah, but that's nice. That's a fun part of the job, or was a fun part of the job. Yeah, I was going to say most of the recipes I collected during my years at Eagle, but I also have continued to write about food for Splurge magazine and now the Active Age, so I use some of those recipes. I also collected a few ones from newer restaurants that had opened after I left the Eagle, and I do got a couple from Butler County in here. For a while I was teaching in the culinary course for Butler Community College, which they had their culinary program was based in Wichita, at the city's South Boston Center on South Woodlawn. They've since moved to a really nice facility, as you might know, in Andover. It's like a world-class culinary facility, and I've got a couple of recipes from that school in here as well. Yes, sir.
What is the oldest continuous operating restaurant in Wichita?
The oldest sit-down restaurant is Savoots up on North Broadway. It's been around since 54, I think. I think it started out of a house up there, and then by the mid-50s, they were open. That's the oldest one that I've ever heard of. Any other questions? Any suggestions for the Active Age? What we could cover out here in Butler County? Yes, sir.
What's your favorite restaurant?
Oh, my favorite restaurant? Yes. I love Vietnamese food, so I really like Saigon on North Broadway. I like Mexican food a lot. There's a great a guy who just grills chicken outside on a grill out on 21st Street, pretty close to, we live in Riverside, pretty close to our house. What else? There's a really colorful burger joint down in South Wichita called Bomber Burger. Has anybody ever been there? It's been around since the 70s, and the owner is known for his colorful language. It's a little 3-2 beer bar, but whatever happens, he always maintains he'll always have the biggest hamburger in town. So first it was I think a half-pound burger, and then somebody else got a half-pound burger, so he moved it up to 2/3 of a pound patty, and then somebody else did that. So now each patty is 3/4 of a pound. He also has like a double and triple burger. So you can imagine how much that is. But it's a great little place. It's in the Oaklawn section of Wichita down off 45th Street, Bomber Burger. So those are three of my favorites. Yes, ma'am.
Where I like your little quizzes in here.
Oh, the quizzes?
Yes, I do pretty good on a few of them. But,
Right. Well, I will.
Anyway, do you have a special place or connection where you get these quizzes?
Oh, yeah, the quizzes are done by a lady in Wichita who just contacted me, I think the first year I was there. And she does it. She just volunteers to do it. She just likes putting them together. And I think they are pretty popular. I hear from a lot of people that they enjoy them.
I have to really think on some of
I was going to say, sometimes I think they're too hard, sometimes I think they're too easy, but most of the feedback I get on them is that people enjoy them.
Yeah.
And I think we've only forgot to put the answers in one time.
Yeah.
We got a lot of calls about that. So we put them next month. Yes?
Doc's Steakhouse still open?
Doc's is not open, no. That's where I got the famous garlic salad recipe from. So Doc's closed about 2 or 3 years ago, and it's just, it's not in a great part of town. It's not a great part of town anymore, and the building's pretty dated. I live pretty close to it, and I don't really see anybody probably going back in there with a restaurant. Maybe some type of other business would go in there. And so you can still get garlic salad in Wichita at New Way, but most people say it's not anything like the ones that the old steakhouses used to serve. And there used to be, up in North Wichita, there was Ken's Club and Abe's Steakhouse and Doc's and probably one more that I'm forgetting about. And they all served very close variations on garlic salad. Mm-hmm. And yes, ma'am?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. She was asking, why do we have so many fast food restaurants and not more sit-down and locally owned places? I think it's probably because the failure rate of restaurants is so high. I think the failure rate of restaurants is something like 85% fail within 2 years. So if you're not a chain with a big amount of capital behind you and and sort of a cookie cutter approach where they figured out how to make a little bit of money, and the margins are very small, I would just say it's just economics. And fast food is very cheap, and so in Wichita. Oh, I think I really don't know. I mean, there's been a couple other big franchise successes out of there. Freddy's has really gotten huge. I think they just opened I think there's over 400 of them now in the United States, and they've only been around about 15 years. For whatever reason, Wichita's always had a reputation for entrepreneurship, and there's been some other restaurant chains out there. I'm thinking of one of the steakhouse chains, not Golden Corral, but something like that also came out of there. I'm not really sure why. But Freddy's, I think, is a pretty good product. Any other questions? Well, I have a couple copies with me right here. And it's also for sale on Amazon and like at Watermarks in Wichita. And they might have a few copies at the History Museum. I'm going to head over there after I get done here and talk to my board member that works there, and I think she's got a few copies. But I'd be happy to sell a few copies here. And like I said, I would appreciate any news tips you have out here. We'd love to put them in the paper, and been trying to increase our news coverage in Harvey and Butler, because a lot of our news is based in Wichita, and I know we have readers out here. So I'm afraid I used up all my time, but. Oh, well, that's the one couple were good friends of ours, lived real close to us in Wichita, and before they moved out to the West Coast to finish their career, and then we found out they were doing this camp host thing, and we just thought it'd be a fun story. My wife actually wrote that story for us, and the other couple was somebody that she knew from business, and I mean, it sounds like a lot of fun to me, you know. Oh, well, the one couple still lives in Wichita. I mean, they have a home here, but they pretty much live in their, I guess, do they say in their RV or, yeah. And then the other ones were former Wichita residents. So they were just people we knew, doing what we thought was something kind of interesting. I'd kind of like to do it myself, but my wife will not camp, so. If we could find a place with a cabin, maybe she would go for it. But sounds fun. Any other questions? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Travel around different little towns looking for little hole in the walls.
Right.
So that might be something, you know, for
A good story?
a good story about the different little towns that have restaurants and.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe I could get Becky Tanner. She writes for us every once in a while, and she's been, I think, to pretty much every place in Kansas, and that would be a good story. I missed that place. What was the little diner they had here that had been around forever? No, I was thinking about that Job Diner. Job.
Yeah,
And that closed, right?
It's a Mexican restaurant. Yeah.
Mexican restaurant? Yeah, no, actually, that's a very good idea. We could maybe list 10 of them that are within an hour driving distance, something like that people would stop in. I like that idea. Betty's? Is it good? Okay. All right, I'll check it out. I like a good burger. All right. Betty's, all right.
I think Brock has a new, I think it's Brock. Restaurant, not necessarily hamburgers, but yeah.
What
Brock.
What's it called?
Rock?
I don't, Rock, Kansas.
In Rock.
Oh, okay. I'm not
Right
familiar with that
off of
town.
the highway, off of 77 or whatever.
Okay.
About 10 miles south of Douglas.
Okay, Rock. Huh, I hadn't heard of that one.
It's a little place, but it's.
Right. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
With how many restaurants that you've been to, what are some like either types of food or restaurants you would like to see?
Oh, and around here, I would like to see some more authentic Italian restaurants. We don't have too much, at least in Wichita. We have what a good friend of mine calls Wich-Italian, which is sort of Americanized Italian. There is a good, fairly new one called Napoli in North Wichita that has some real authentic type dishes. But I'd like to see some more of that. We don't have a Greek restaurant anymore. We used to have a couple Greek restaurants, and I miss those. It's close to Lebanese food, but there are some differences. What else? Those are the two that really come to mind right away.
Sort of along that line.
Yes.
There used to be I think a West African restaurant at one time that my wife and I like to eat at, and I think there's going to be a new one I saw in the paper somehow. Are there any plans for any kind of that kind of food?
African, did you say?
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, the one I know of most recently was on the west side, and it went out of business shortly after it opened. It was over off of, what was that street? Close to Ridge in Central. And I think it was only open a couple months. And then I think that food is it's really familiar to a lot of people. And if I think for one to be successful, it might want to locate up by the college, because they have, a significant amount of North African students from that area, maybe could patronize it. But so far, there was a really nice one that opened on Rock Road years ago, but it also only lasted about a year.
Question. Have the local restaurants, are they recovering from the COVID pandemic yet?
They are recovering, but the main problem is I think they have plenty of customers. They can't find workers. A lot of them have cut their hours, or they'll cut out lunch service, or they'll be closed 2 or 3 days a week, and they just can't get people to come in and work. I don't know how people are surviving without those jobs, but it seems like a lot of the people that used to work in that business don't want to do it anymore. And so that's a big problem for them. And there's also some supply chain issues with certain ingredients they have a hard time getting. Yes. Well, thank you. Well, great. I'm glad to hear it. Well, well, I'm glad to hear that, and we're always looking for ways to improve it. So if I'm open to suggestions, especially about stories to cover, that kind of thing. And I wish we could make it a little bigger. Our cost really went up as far as paper and postage really went up for us. And so even though we're a nonprofit and we get the cheapest possible rate, the Postal Service raised our rates it ended up being like about a 20% increase last year. So we had to find some ways to, kind of squeeze some, cut our costs a little bit. But hopefully we can keep it going for another 43 years. We're going to try anyway. Yes, sir. I've heard good reviews on it. I actually haven't even eaten there, but my wife's been there a couple times. She likes it. First Mile Canteen. So there's a First Mile Kitchen opened up about 2 years ago in Bradley Fair, around the corner from Yaya's, and then they've opened up a branch downtown in this really interesting building. Fidelity built a parking garage that has restaurants and retail on the bottom, and on the top it has a garden on top of this parking garage. And they say it's the biggest aerial, and they're raising vegetables there, biggest garden of its type in the Midwest. So anyway, it's real close to, I mentioned that Butler Community College has a really nice culinary school in Andover. Now Wichita, the reason they had to do that was because Wichita State kicked them out of Wichita, which they had the right to do under some kind of agreement, however the colleges work. And Wichita State has started its own culinary school, and it's so located in the old Henry's department store downtown. It's very nice as well. And I don't know if there's really room for 2 culinary programs like that in this area, but I guess we'll see.
So what about farm-to-table type of restaurants like First Mile?
Yeah, farm to table. Well, there's a couple. Eldersley Farm is a restaurant. It's not open. I think it's only open 3 days a week. They grow some of their own food. It's interesting. A lot of the better restaurants, they might not grow their own food, but they do, and they might still buy a lot of their food from Cisco or a supplier like that. But they do have local growers who will bring them fresh herbs. When Wichita this area has a fairly short growing season, so it's not like you can grow a lot of this stuff year round unless you're doing it indoors. So they'll have people buy and bring them certain specialty products, but there's not we're not California. We can't really grow everything we need to eat here. But I think Elderslie is the best one I can think of. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for having me. And if anybody would like a book, I'd be happy to sell you one, sign it, and so on, or sign you up to get our paper. So thank you.
He's really tall. Thank you, Joe. All right, we're going to take our break. We'll probably come back about 5 or 10 till. So take our break, and we will get back together for our next speaker. Our next speaker is Cindy Higgins. Cindy is going to present Fresh Produce, Kansas Orchardists, Market Growers, and Truck Farmers. A program is brought to us today by Humanities Kansas, an independent nonprofit leading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. It says please take a moment to turn off your cell phones. Hopefully we've done that. Cindy is a journalist and a historian whose research interests focus on Kansas industry. She received her master's degree in journalism from the University of Kansas and joined the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau in 2012. Please welcome Cindy Higgins.
I want to start off by saying you guys are such lucky duckies. I wish we had a program like that where I'm at, your Life Enrichment. And I want to thank Tricia for inviting me, and I want to thank my people back at my table for being so cordial when I got here. So it's just really exciting for me to see an organization like this. And I came early just so I could hear Joe talk, because it just sounded like such a delightful topic to hear about iconic eats and the newspaper. So just getting all my gratitude out. Now I'm going to try to figure out the technology here. So today we're here, we're going to time travel, and we're going to look at what produce did grow in Kansas, does grow, and may grow. And before we start, though, we're going to kind of do an overview of agricultural just to put it all in context. And probably in about 10 minutes, we're all going to have to deal with the tornado drill, so that'll be our break. So when settlers came to Kansas, they pretty much grew crops to feed their family. They were subsistence farmers, and they grew the type of crops that they had from the places from which they came. Some of the crops worked and some didn't. Corn worked. And when I'm talking about corn, I'm talking about that hard field corn. It's when you ground it up for cornmeal or you'd feed it to your livestock. And it was this time of experimentation. You know, farmers do experiments all the time anyhow, but now they're in a whole new area. They're trying different things. And of all things, people in Washington, D.C. were calling a lot of the shots. They would make suggestions, and they'd send a lot of promotions down. And like in the 1870s, they said, Kansas farmers, we think you should grow mulberry trees. Because if you grow those mulberry trees, then you can have silkworms, and we'll have a silk industry in Kansas. So a lot of farmers did, but that kind of went by the wayside when the Italians and the Japanese took over. And then there was this big push in 1880 for kefir corn. It came from Africa. It's kind of a sorghum grain. And they said, plant that. And Kansas farmers did for about 40 years. And after a while, they said, oh, forget about that. We're going to go over to Milo. And what's also interesting is during the early part of the 20th century, they were really into making Kansas farmers plant broom corn. And that should be of interest to you all, because Wichita was the broom corn capital of the United States in the 1920s. So with all this experimentation, some of it was fueled by David Fairchild. He was in Washington, D.C., but he grew up in Kansas. His dad was a professor at K-State. He goes from Kansas to Washington, D.C. He's really good at schmoozing with rich people and having them fund his travels all over the world to find plants and seeds to bring back to the United States. He's the one who introduced avocados to the United States. He brought in mangoes and quinoa and ruby red grapefruit. And now if he probably did that, he'd be arrested because it's kind of against the law to do that. But back then, he was kind of a glamorous hero. And there was a book written about that for people who like to look it up. It's called The Food Explorer, and it came out a couple of years ago. And it tells all about his adventures going around the world, bringing back plants and seeds to the United States. But in Kansas, we're not known for our mangoes. We are known for that hard winter wheat that the Russian Mennonites brought in 1875. And within a couple of decades, it took all over Kansas. So today, Kansas is usually #1 in wheat, and we're usually #1 in Milo, and we do really good in corn and sorghum. And so essentially, Kansas is a hamburger state. We grow the grains that make the bun, and then we feed the grain to the cattle that makes the meat in between. But I'm here to talk about specialty crops, and that's what they call things like tomatoes and onions and cucumbers. We might call them produce, vegetables, and fruits. And in the United States, if you look at a map, everything on the green indicates vegetable production. So you'll see Kansas is pretty much at the almost bottom. We don't grow very many vegetables. And in terms of fruits, we do a little bit better because they count the pecan orchards in South East Kansas as a fruit. So no surprise, California and Florida grow a lot more because they have longer seasons. And if you look at this map, it shows the produce crop that's the most prolific in each state. And so in Kansas, it's a potato. And spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about potatoes later on because we've been growing potatoes since the very start of Kansas. My mouth's getting really dry, so I'm apologizing if I have a lisp. So all of this fruit and vegetables, produce, they're also known as horticulture, and that includes the nuts and the flowers. And some people say in coming years, Kansas is going to become more of a player in horticulture, you know, because those southern states, they're kind of running out of water, they're getting warmer, and I say, well, of course, Kansas could be, you know, agriculture is our #1 industry, 90% of our land is farmland, but I, as a historian, would say, well, shoot, we could do it. In the first 50 years, Kansas was kind of known as a fruit place, a produce place. And one of the earliest fruits and plants that was grown in, thank you, see, thank you, Patricia, again, were apples. A lot of the settlers, you know, brought apples because remember, you can't go out and buy them. And a lot of the apples were grown in the east and central Kansas because that's where the settlers were. And Joseph Stamen was from Leavenworth, and Leavenworth is Kansas's first city. And when he came from the East Coast, he had a lot of money. He brought 1,000 different apple varieties because his goal was to figure out the very best apple that would grow in Kansas. And this picture here is one of those idealized pictures of his farm, and you could tell it was very nice. So in all of his experimentations, he decided in 1866 he found the perfect apple for Kansas. It's called the Stamen's Winesap. He named it after himself. And actually it became very popular in the United States. It was known as being from Kansas, and a lot of specialty orchards today still grow the Stamen's Winesap. So if we have a Kansas apple, it's probably this one. Frederick Wellhouse came to Leavenworth at the exact same time. He was a big apple powerhouse. He didn't really care about having the best. He just wanted to have the most. And he had apples. He grew thousands and thousands of apple trees in 3 different counties. And he specialized in only 5 varieties, which are here. And all the newspapers loved to talk about him because he would just fill up train car after train car. And they called him the Apple King of the world. Well, I'm over there by Lawrence. I live by the Kansas River. Right across the river is a town called Linwood, and that's where William Byers lived. And he was called the Crabapple King of Kansas. And some of you might go, who would grow crab apples? They're sour, they're little, they're not yummy. Well, he was growing them around 1880s and 1890s. We had state prohibition, and he figured out that he could make hard apple cider out of his crab apples, and he could worm his way through all the prohibition rules. The problem was other people figured out loopholes too. He didn't sell enough crab apples. He went bust. 1897, creditors seized his 600 acres of crab apples. And by 1900, we grew so many apples, it's almost the equivalent of today's amount of Milo acreage. And it was all over the place, but we also grew a lot of apple seedlings, baby apple trees, and all that was going on was by Topeka. And some people had come over from Ohio. They figured out that sandy soil was really good. They always rented somebody's land because the apple seedlings used up so much of the nutrients. And we were producing 90% of the apple trees for the United States around Topeka, Kansas, of all places. And I have a picture of the grafting wax because hundreds of people in Topeka would spend all their winters, you know, grafting these apple trees because there's a whole process to make sure it is true. And so that was a major industry in Topeka and in Kansas, are apple seedlings. So here is a picture of Kansas. We've got 105 counties. Every county has done commercial produce production, and some of them are kind of well known. I've got a picture of a watermelon up there, and that's in Clyde. They said, we've been growing watermelons for 100 years. We're the watermelon capital. Well, here's another watermelon down there. It's in Thayer, Kansas. They say, actually, we're the watermelon capital. We grow the most. You know, I've got peaches there from Hayesville, you know, because they grew a lot of peaches there. Up here in the corner, Wyandotte County's always been known for its strawberries. Douglas County kind of grew a lot of grapes. But up there in the very tip-top corner, I've got some blackberries, and that's for Donovan County. It is the most northeastern county in Kansas, and I say that's the fruitiest place in Kansas, because if you look at it, they grew so much fruit there. One of it was their wine grapes. Jacob Brenner came over from Germany. He brought his little cuttings. He planted so many grapes, and his neighbors did in his family. You know, he was growing about 25 different varieties. He was making wine out of it for churches. Prohibition comes, kills it, you know, but they still kept growing their grapes. What Donovan County was really known for was all of its berries. You know, the strawberries, the raspberries, and their biggest one was their black raspberries. And this is a picture in Donovan County of them loading them up into the rail cars. And what's interesting about it is these people didn't have big old acreages. They were growing their berries on 3 acres, 5 acres, and they would get pickers come from all over the place, almost like a summer vacation. Like, let's go up to Wathena and pick blackberries. That sounds marvelous, you know? And they would camp out in sheds and tents and whole families. You know, they'd make some extra money, but it was just kind of a fun way to do it. Kind of reminds me of you talking about going to the campgrounds and, you know, being a host there. That's just how they spent their summer. But in other places, and this actually came down from Ottawa, they wrote, we couldn't get pickers to pick them for love or money, even if we'd finished gloves. It was very hard to get those pickers. And this author was talking about dewberries, and dewberries were very popular in the early 1900s. They kind of look like blackberries, but they're all prickly like gooseberries. And I don't know if any of you all have ever picked gooseberries. I have. Yes, they're very hard to pick, and you got to pick a lot to get hardly any of them. So I can see why he might say that. And that comment actually came from the Kansas State Horticultural Society. This was a group that founded in 1869, that Joseph Stamen from Leavenworth Wellhouse. They were very big members of it. They all would share their experiences, their failures, you know, their successes. They would have annual meetings. You know, what is going to work in Kansas? And this is also around 1900 to 1905, was William Barnes. He was the secretary. And if you know Kansas government, the secretary means you're the big top guy of the whole government department. He was the secretary of this organization. And at that time, it had its own office at the state capitol. It was putting out publications like this because produce was just so big in Kansas. You know, now the Kansas Department of Agriculture has kind of enveloped, you know, horticulture under it. But at its time, it was totally separate, while Department of Ag was just kind of a fledgling. And in a lot of those reports, they talk about potatoes, because I told you that we grow a lot of potatoes. They grew up from the very beginning, and they didn't really experiment with potatoes. They pretty much grew 2 varieties, the early Ohio and the Irish cobbler. And they grew a lot of these in these truck farms. That's where you're usually growing about 1 crop, and they grow it along the rivers. In the Kansas City area, it was from Kansas City to Manhattan, all along the Kansas River. They like that sandy soil. And down around here, it was the Arkansas River Valley. You get an awful lot of produce, and a lot of potatoes were grown down here. And this is where I just can't resist. I've got to put this definition in, because a lot of people think a truck farmer is somebody who's got a truck. It comes from an old Latin word, has nothing to do with trucks. And it has to do with the kind of person that might be growing a lot of corn, and then on the side they have like maybe 10 or 20 acres and they're putting it in like potatoes, versus a market gardener who pretty much only has smaller acreage and they're growing a whole variety of crops from the very beginning to the very end. So it's just 2 different types of farming operations. And so these truck farmers, I was going to talk about 3 of the potato kings of Kansas. It's past 10 o'clock. I don't hear a tornado drill. Let's just keep going then here. It's like party. Okay, one of them was Edwin Taylor. He was up there by Edwardsville, which is kind of in the Kansas City area. He didn't know anything about potatoes, but once again, he had some money, enough for 400 acres. He plants a bunch of potatoes and sweet potatoes in this nice sandy soil, and he produces so many that he's been called the Potato King of the West, becomes a state senator, and he builds a very big mansion, which he calls Otatop, which is potato spelled backwards. All right, keep our brains flexible here. Another one who lived very close to him was Junius Grove. He was actually the potato king of the world. The United States Department of Agriculture, they gave him that name and these other names. They loved Junius Grove because he grew the same amount, 400 acres, but he grew so much per each acre. He grew 4 times as much as anybody else. And he's got a story of, he was from Kentucky, he was a former slave, he had less than $1 in his pocket, he walks to Kansas, and he just does hard work and works for other people and saves his money and has an awful lot of sons, you know, and then he puts up this nice farming operation, makes an awful lot of money, and he said his success was really pulverizing that soil. I mean, he made it really fine, and he hated weeds. Never had any kind of weeds, and a lot of people would use little machines to cut up a potato and put the seeds in. He insisted on hand cutting. He said that was the secret to his success. And so that's a picture of him and his very nice house. And another one, kind of in the same area by them, was kind of by Bonner Springs, was Henry Ewing. He had twice as many acres, and frankly, he just made a ton of money quick on potatoes. And he got out of it, and he kind of got into social reform, because he was very mad at what he called the loafers of Kansas City. He said there was loafers there in Kansas City. They're standing on the street corners. They're not doing anything. And I think they need to come out to the farm, and they'll learn a livelihood, and they'll make some money. So he went all around the Midwest trying to promote people to put money into farmland and get those loafers off the streets in his Back to Farm movement. And so when you're doing a potato harvest, you got to harvest them, and a lot of times you're using a horse or a mule. And then you would grade the potatoes, and you're trying to get rid of any that are defective, and you want to make sure they're all well shaped. And then you put them in those potato sacks. And they usually kind of contained 110, 120 pounds. And I love this picture because every picture I've ever seen, it's those burlap bags. It's more than 100 pounds, and it's the skinniest guys picking them up. And if I had a bag here with 25 pounds, which I did in the car, but I didn't bring it in, and you tried to lift it, you'd go, how could they ever pick up 5 times this much? And they did it all day long, because when they were putting it there, oh, this is in Wamego. I forgot about that. You didn't have to always put it in bags. You could also put it in boxes. And Wamego insists it was the sweet potato capital of Kansas from 1880 to 1920. So they'd get those bags, and they'd put them in the train, and they had to do it just right so that it would travel well. But they had to pretty much pick it, bag it, sew it, get it on there probably in about an hour, because you didn't want the sun to scald it. If it got any kind of sun, it ruined it, and then it would go bad later on. So they had to move very fast, because a lot of this produce, it's perishable. And so they really could get start traveling places when rail cars became refrigerated. But even so, they had to move fast because this stuff didn't last very long. And they'd get it there on the rail cars, and the railroads were always working with the produce farmers, because they went, this is a big business. Kansas is going to this is going to be the Kansas business. So they really encouraged all of the produce people to form associations. They said, you know, everybody here in Garden City, get everybody together. You could hire one person to market it. We can buy supplies in bulk. Over here in Donovan County, let's do it. Let's build a big building. And you see all over Kansas between 1910 and 1920, a lot of these associations, because you can grow produce, but marketing, that is the trick. So the associations really helped. And so you're growing this, and oftentimes a commission man would come out to your field. And you say, I'll take all those potatoes, I'll give you X amount of money. So you might sell it in the field, or you might just sell it by telegraph, and you know there's a good price, and you send it someplace. And a lot of this Kansas produce was going to, like this place right here was a wholesaler there in Topeka, Kansas. And you see all these ads in newspapers saying, we want your cantaloupes, we want your watermelons, because they really wanted that Kansas produce. And some of your produce might go to canneries, and canneries are just a fascinating part of our early Kansas history. Nobody was really canning produce, but then we get the Civil War, and with every time you have a war, you really up your game. And so they started, canning a lot of things for the soldiers, and so people get the idea of canneries, and around 1880, every Chamber of Commerce type version in a small town said, well, let's get a cannery, because we can grow our produce and then we'll can it and we'll make a lot of money. So you see that in a lot of the newspapers. This is just a part of some of the mini canneries, and they all flourished between 1880, say, and 1910. And it also might go to a specialized processing plant. And these were both in Topeka. A lot of people around Topeka grew dill and cucumbers to make pickles with at the Coon factory, or they were really into horseradish, of all things. And Kansas was a major horseradish producer because nobody else was doing it. And this woman, Mrs. Byron Wilcote, said she had the very best, and she manufactured her horseradish for a long time. So I find this fascinating, horseradish in Kansas. And And then also, a lot of those berries and fruits, this is in Kansas City, Kansas. It's a pie manufacturer. So, they got their start around 1905, and every week they put out 75,000 pies, apple and cherry pies. It's like, where were all those berries going? In the pies. Now, this is a picture of the Kansas City Farmers Market. So only in your very biggest towns, Kansas City and Wichita, would they build these edifices. They were permanent, and they would say, come here, farmers, and, sell your products. And in the Kansas City area, the whole goal was to be the first one in. If you had the first one in when rhubarb, you were going to sell out, or spinach, and that was the whole thing. Who could get there first? And a lot of the people in the Kansas City market were interesting because they were from Belgium. They lived about 15 miles from Kansas City in a place called Shawnee. They'd come from Belgium and some from Germany. They had very small acreages. They're European. Here in Kansas, you get hundreds of acres. They were lucky to have 10 or 20 acres. And so they really knew how to make the most out of their small acreages. So they come over here. A lot of them are settling in Wyandotte County and Shawnee. And, they grew these market vegetables. They started growing at the very start of the season to the end. They had very large, a lot of times Catholic families, and they'd get in their horse at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they'd go, it would take 4 hours to get down there to downtown Kansas City. They'd set up at 6 o'clock in the morning, they'd sell out in an hour, and then they'd go home 4 hours, and then they'd go work a full day. And every instance I've read about their lives, they said it was a marvelous life. We loved it. It was great. So I'm not feeling sorry for them, but they were hard workers. And so when I said that they were from Europe, because of these small acreages, they were into intensive gardening. So they had some tricks. They would use cold frames, and they would use hotbeds, and they liked to use greenhouses, which was a novel concept to others in Kansas. And so to make a hotbed, you pretty much dig about 1.5 feet, a pit, and then they'd fill it with manure, a lot of times from the stockyards. And then they put a layer of straw on top, about 6 inches of soil. They plant their seed, they put glass on top of it, and then the manure decomposes, it keeps it warm, so they get this head start on the season, so they could be there at the farmer's market saying, look, I've got lettuce, it's only March, I'm ready to go. And that's how they made their living. And a lot of times when they were coming over from Europe, they were introducing new crops. And you might say, tomatoes? And I'm going, well, in the 1800s, they were called poison apples. People thought they were from a member of the nightshade family. It's like, I'm not going to touch that. But it became popular in the Civil War with canning. It kind of got introduced. People decided it was more than a decorative plant, and tomatoes caught on. And now they're the #1 seller at farmers markets, and kind of like they're second to potatoes in Kansas for its popularity. But it had a slow start here in Kansas. And this is a picture of a farmer's market outside, in more like Kansas City, Kansas, because a lot of the smaller growers, they didn't want to go all the way to downtown Kansas City. So when they got automobiles, which people started getting around 1905 to 1920, they could kind of set up in smaller communities. So you get the rise of the smaller farmers markets. You didn't have to grow as much, you didn't have to go as far. You start getting these roadside stands. Now, K-State is really into this now. They're really watching it. And so they did a report, and they said, this is around 1935. They go, well, we've got roadside marketing, but it's only, it's up there in that Donovan County, northeast Kansas. It's down there by Kansas City, and it's down there in those river valleys. And I don't know about you all, I grew up seeing a lot of roadside stands. I don't know where they maybe were around here, and they're still around. I always like the ones that are the free will donation. It's just like, oh, that's cool concept. And then if you were growing, because people had automobiles, all of a sudden they could come out to your place. I'm in Hutchinson. A lot of apples were grown there. People might go out to the orchard and they'd get a whole bunch because they'd take them home and can them, and canning kind of peaked in 1940s. And at my house, I think it must have peaked about 10 years ago, because last year I sold off all my canning supplies because I go, why am I holding on to it? It's a whole wall of my basement. I'm not canning. Are any of you guys still canning? Excuse me, Tricia, what are you canning?
Green beans.
Green beans? Because you grow them and have them?
Because, yeah, we've just done it my whole life, so I've kept it up.
And that's what I did. I was like, I can because you can. And I go, yeah, I can buy it. I don't know. So anyhow, home canning peaked in 1943, but it was the reason why they would go out there. And of course, they went to grocery stores. And, this is a picture of the grocery store at Shawneetown up there by Kansas City. And actually, this is where I got a lot of my interest in this topic, because they had an old time, kind of like the one in Wichita, an Old West historic place that they had built. And they decided to switch it to 1929. They said, you know, we're going to leave the 1800s behind, and every building is going to be from 1929, and they are celebrating their history of having all these Belgian market gardeners there. So it represents that, and I did a lot of research for their exhibits and things like that, because I'm a journalist, and you always have to have an extra job. And so, you know, they even have, like, you know, buildings there that shows how they processed it, and their trucks and the whole things like that. So if you're ever up in Kansas City and interested in this subject, do go by Shawneetown number 1929. And then also people might get their produce, and they'd go house to house, just kind of like, you know, like ice cream trucks, you know. They were called the hucksters, and you see a lot of that. They just go up and down the street saying, hey, I got fresh carrots, I got fresh that, and people would kind of go out there and do that. 1910 is what I think is the zenith of this. People came to Kansas, and, you know, they were all like, what are we going to do? You know, the newspapers are encouraging them to plant produce. You know, they might have like 5 acres of strawberries, 5 acres of this. You know, we're shipping out a lot of stuff to Colorado. We're shipping things west. We're shipping it south up to Minneapolis. It's a great thing, and everybody likes it. But then when something becomes successful, then other people copy it. And that's the problem. It starts going down after 1910s, because other states kind of went, look at Kansas. Let's do what Kansas is doing. We're Colorado. We're going to start growing things like that. And so they start kind of nipping into their market. So in 1924, this is kind of gives you an idea of what was being grown in Kansas. And to be fair, if I had potatoes included in here, it'd be the entire pie chart almost. So we grew those tomatoes, the sweet corn. You get a lot of melons in Kansas and sweet potatoes. And it always surprises me, really, how many watermelons have been grown in Kansas. And it was even grown in this is southwestern Kansas. And they grew a lot of watermelons just because they made a lot of money off the seeds. Not the watermelons, it was the seeds. It's like, okay. And then in terms of fruit, in 1924, no surprise, there's apples there. Peaches, and peaches are an iffy kind of crop. And I always like to see this plums. It's like, whoever goes out and buys plums? But plums were grown a lot there in 1924. By 1939, there's an estimate that only 0.5%, that's like less than 1%, of all Kansas farms are growing produce commercially. And that seems like, well, gee whiz, not very much. However, there's been estimates that if only 2% of Kansas farmers grew produce, we could feed Kansas. We don't need to bring in anything from South America, anything from California. We can just feed our own, because it doesn't take that much. So by 1940, K-State is coming in again, trying to figure out who's growing what. And they said, we used to have an awful lot of orchards in Kansas, but now it's really just kind of down there in that Arkansas Valley, and it's up there in that northeast Kansas there again. Those are the people that really where all the orchards are. And then in 1950, all of a sudden our Kansas farms, they're starting to, you know, there was a lot of them, there's not as many, they're consolidating. Washington, D.C. is saying, go big or go out, grow corn. You know, grains basically reign in Kansas. And this is where I want to kind of cue, you know, psychedelic music, because then we get the 1960s. And all of a sudden, it's the flower power era. It's the back to the land movement. Organic gardening says, well, yeah, we always know about the rich people who go out and have their places and those hardworking middle class, but now we've got this new group of budding country people. They're hippies, they're student rebels, they're far out young people. And I love this, because I remember people's older brothers and sisters, they're being in college saying, Mom and Dad, I'm quitting college. I'm going to go out and get 5 acres, and I'm just going to go live off the land. And the parents were going, oh, no. And it's like shades of 100 years ago. It's subsistence farming. It's like you're just growing enough for yourself. And so the Bible of that time was Mother Earth News, which of all places now is based in Topeka, Kansas. And you get these words that we use today like, oh, local, sustainable, organic, natural. But I think it has all its roots in the 1970s. And it goes back to 1975 in Kansas. We start getting the first of our co-op groceries. And people are buying things in bulk because they want to eat healthy. You see it in our college towns. And, you know, now these things have evolved into Whole Foods and very fancy grocery stores that I can't afford. But it's marvelous food, and it's very nice. But it kind of got its start from these co-op groceries. And it gets its starts from farmers markets, which this newest version started in Kansas in 1975. Lawrence, Kansas says, we were the first to come in, and, you know, Lawrence, it's a party, everything's going on. And now every small town wants to have a farmer's market, you know, brings in tourists. I think it's really good for community spirit. It's like people like to go down there and hear music, go around, and this is the one that I think you have in El Dorado, and I might be wrong. Is anybody an expert on farmers markets here? Okay, well, I think you guys are starting up in June, and that's what it is, but I could be wrong. So, I mean, so we get these farmers market. I used to work with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. They kind of cover farmers markets, and I went up on their floor and I said, hey, how many do we have? And they go, 85. It changes every year. It's hard to keep up with it. You know, they come, they go, different things like that. But all I know is everybody loves farmers markets. But farmers markets, they're hard. You know, you have to go there, you have to set up, you have the produce. And a lot of people who grow say, you know, it's easier if they just come out and pick it on my place. Some people have their own farmers market. I heard about one who has it Sunday morning, and they sell out between 10 and 1 o'clock. It's like, who would have thought Sunday morning, people going to farmers market, you know? And what I like about this is that a lot of their advertising is just done on Facebook. And I was talking to Tricia saying, maybe I should have a category called Facebook Farmers, because there was somebody in here who's just food farms. What was it?
Shop Kansas Farms.
Shop Kansas Farms, and he had to leave. And, you know, it's like how everybody is spreading the word about produce they have available, and it's all done through Facebook. And it makes sense because you say, hey, the cherries are coming on tomorrow, and if you're following that, you know to just go out there then there, because you don't have a chance to go out there and advertise. So it's interesting the impact of Facebook that it has on our produce growing. And I know in Kansas, everybody's doing what they can to keep this going. I mean, we've got organizations, we've got the Rural Center, we've got, you know, incentives. You know, the feds are always giving grant money to K-State every year. They try to do a different specialty crop. What I love is Seward County Community College and Johnson County Community College, because they have a come and learn how to be a truck farmer, a market gardener here, 9 months from start to finish. You know, you plant your own and we'll show you how to do it. And I think, wouldn't those Belgians of Shawnee have found that delightful? My kid's going to college to learn how to be a farmer, you know. But, you know, it's this whole idea of we're trying to do everything we can. I'm kind of up there by the Kansas City area, and Catholic Charities, they're very interested in all the refugees that we get in the Kansas City area. You know, they're coming over here, they don't speak the language, you know, their skill set isn't working here. And so it's just kind of like those Belgians. They're taking unclaimed land that nobody wants, it's pretty bad, and they say, here, grow this, and then we'll go to the farmer's market. So they have a lot of different plots there where they're growing around Kansas City produce, people from different countries, so they can make some money and learn a livelihood. So I always say, well, let's look at 100 years from now, just to kind of fool with our brains. Because I also worked for the Kansas Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. I went to conferences all the time. And they were all saying, you know, we're running out of water. It's not looking good. They've done studies. 1890s was the wettest year. The tree rings have talked, and the next 500 years, it's kind of downhill. There's a reason why they call this a desert. That's my only downer thing I'm going to say. But it does impact what we grow. For example, up there in northwest Kansas, when they're kind of running out of water in the aquifers, they've switched from corn, because corn just takes so much water. And they're kind of doing more of these different types of beans. You know, it's easier, it's a commodity crop, it's not as perishable, and it kind of makes sense. Down there in southern Kansas, people said they're growing okra for sale. That's something that is a southern crop, but we can grow it up here in Kansas. You know, is it getting warmer? I got armadillos up by me. I never thought I'd see 30 years ago, but I do. You know, and the same thing. There's some people in Kansas that are growing peanuts now, and that's a subtropical plant. So it is getting warmer enough that we can kind of grow those produce crops. You know, we have the greenhouses, but these hoop tunnels, these high tunnels, you know, they're all over the place, and that gives everybody their start on the season. These are actually by K-State. They're about 5 miles from my house. They're always trying different crops in there to see what's going to work the best. I say if you're looking at produce, you're looking at water, look to Israel, because Israel is a desert and they're very smart there. And this is from Israel, and what they have, they're all into that technology of heat sensors and water sensors. And, you know, this is 1 acre and they're growing all this. It is the equivalent of 10 acres because it's just so mechanized, the things that they can do there, and it's all done indoors. I think a lot of times we think technology is going to figure out the problem. Whatever it is, technology will figure it out. And it is doing a lot. You see in California, they are coming up with robots that weed, because weeding is one of the reasons people don't like produce, because it's so labor intensive. And picking, see, these yellow peppers, there's like a machine that can go by and just pick the peppers off like that. So that makes it more easier to do. What's fascinating is all of this agritainment. I remember apple orchards when I grew up, and you go out there and you might get some apple cider, and now you can't even go to those places in October because there are cars stacked out for like 10 miles. Everybody in the world is going to go pay to go pick a pumpkin and pay for the pumpkin and pay on the ride. And it's almost like Disneyland, I think. It's just so crowded, and each year it gets more and more busy, and I think it will continue to be like that. And that actually influences how things are grown, because when you have these apple trees, the producer doesn't want you to get in a ladder and go up way high and fall, so they're growing shorter trees that kind of bloom earlier, and they spindle. They go out like this instead of up, so they're easier to pick. So it changes the way that things are grown. This blew my mind. It's called an agrihood, and I saw it in California. And so they're saying, we don't really want golf courses. We want to hire a farmer to come in, and he'll plant this giant garden, and I will take my children there, and we will go pick our green beans, and we'll pick our things, and we'll have this lovely agricultural experience. And so I thought, well, yeah, okay, that's California. Well, I go up to Des Moines to see my daughter a couple of months ago, and they're putting an agri-hood out there by Des Moines, and they're going to have the goat yoga and the whole bit. And I was like, Des Moines? Then I go back to Lawrence, and we're starting to put the agri-hoods in, and I go, oh, wouldn't my husband's relatives up there in Sabetha, Kansas love that, paying a farmer to kind of grow that kind of stuff. But it's all part of this experience. And this is in Berlin. And they also have that whole, I don't want to just go to the grocery store and get my food. I want my local food. I want to pick my food myself. So they grow the food in warehouses downtown, and then they take it, roots and all, into the grocery store just so you can pick your own plant. And so if you guys are getting tired, I'm coming to the end here. And I just want to go over some of the things I said. I said, hey, if you want to know about David Fairchild, it's that Food Explorer book. And, we had a Kansas apple, and we still do. It's the Stamen's wine sap. And when you're talking about Kansas being number one, you can say, we were number one in apple seedlings in 1920. Hello. We had several kings. That's what they always called somebody who grew the most of it. And Junius Grove is probably the most famous producer. He keeps coming up in different documentaries. And his trick was to really get that fine soil and keep those weeds out. We had horseradish in Kansas around Topeka, fields and fields of it, because we were making horseradish sauce. Our number one produce still today is potatoes. A lot of people are trying to do their part to keep produce growing in Kansas. And, we're all being aware, I've got the beans there, of, our water scarcity. So I have told you an awful lot of what I know, and I could go on. But I'm going to stop here in case you want to argue with me, or hopefully you'll ask me some of the questions. You guys are great question askers. And I just want to say thank you, Tricia, for inviting me. And I am done, and my technology worked all right. Okay, thank you. Okay. So.
I have a question. Just raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic. Question? Somebody has a question.
Yeah, just one. Pardon?
How about your comments on the genetically modified fruits, vegetables, corn, like Mexico not wanting to import genetically modified corn?
Okay, so I talk about the history of produce. I do not claim to be a great grower. I can't tell you how to grow asparagus or things like that. I don't personally have any opinions about that. I don't see it marked that well, or I'm not looking for it. But I think probably people in the audience might have a feeling. What are your feelings about it?
I don't know enough about it.
Yeah, so you don't know enough about it? I mean, I don't even know. I thought for a while they were marking stuff in grocery stores. Now I just see them saying organic or local. They're not really saying, is it GMO you put on that? I don't know. So that is not my field of expertise, but I think it's a fascinating topic. Yes?
You mentioned the potatoes in Kansas. It's a huge crop.
Huge.
Sorry.
For Kansas. For Kansas.
How does it compare to Idaho, which is really big too?
Well, I don't. I don't know that offhand, but what's interesting about the Kansas potatoes is they didn't really grow potatoes for seed and then use it. They always got it from the Red River Valley, which was up north. It was almost like a religion. And so that they would only buy that seed and grow it down here because they said that was the best. And you see that over and over again for decades. They would only use this Red River, which is kind of, I don't know if it's Minneapolis or it's just that whole area up there, yeah. I think maybe it was just better for it. So, Joe, did you have a question? Okay. So he's just been stunned with all this information. He's processing it. Okay. All right. Wait, another one.
Got a mic again.
Well, just, you said that there's a future with global warming, and so how, what's the actual chance that it's going to?
I did not say global warming.
Okay.
I did not say that. I said that I'm up there by Kansas City and I see armadillos. And the first time I saw armadillos was down in Texas about 40 years ago. And I went, aren't those just the cutest things? And then every decade they kind of kept in Oklahoma and that, and I'm going, guys, I don't know about global warming, but we got armadillos up there on the side of the road, And then, like I said, it's just, only thing I know is like, you could not grow okra commercially or peanuts, and now you can in southern Kansas. I know I was talking about the pecan orchards that everybody knows about in southeast Kansas, and they're also up there by Osawatomie. K-State's also, they've got a lot of test pilots around Lawrence because they're growing a variety there. And pecans are very tricky, they need to have that, and it's kind of coming up there. So that's all I'm just saying. There are some instances that show that Kansas is getting warmer. Okay.
Let me rephrase.
Okay.
Less water, how is the future in growing in Kansas? As we seem to lose less, aquifer, whatever it is, we seem to have less water.
Well,
Would you repeat the question, please?
yeah.
Can't
Question?
get the mic to him fast.
Where's our microphone? No, he said he's talking about water, and he's saying, do I see water scarcity affecting the crops and things like that? And so, once again, this is not my field of expertise, but it's a fascinating question. I just know that for my job, when I worked for the Kansas Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, and I was a person that talked about water. You should never have me talk about water, but I was the person. And I had to go to conferences after conferences, and this was actually more like 8 years ago. Every conference is saying, in western Kansas, we're running out of water. It's 10 years. I mean, there are some aquifers that are recharging a little bit kind of here in the middle, but it's like, but we're running out of water. And so, there's different types of things they're trying, like voluntary, not using as much and things like that. And, in Kansas, water rights is a very tricky subject, because you can't control that. I just thought it was exciting to say that they're getting away from corn, because corn does take an awful lot of water. I don't know, maybe western Kansas is going to be like solar farms or something like that. I never thought I'd see these huge solar farms when I'm driving around Illinois, and there's that. So I'm kind of getting off the topic, but I think it kind of reminds me, I'm driving down I-35 this morning. It's 7 o'clock in the morning, and they're talking about COVID. They're going, a lot of people weren't worried about COVID because you can't see it. If it was a virus and it was bright purple right in front of you, you'd say, oh, I'm not going to go over there. But it's invisible, and you can't see it, so you might walk right through it. So it's easy not to be afraid of when you can't see it, And I think that's a lot of how we think about in water. We don't really see it, but, they always say Kansas, it's 2 different states. There's eastern Kansas, we got all this, and then there's western Kansas. And I've been one for years, I'm going to get off on this topic, is where are all our streams? Our streams are drying up, our rivers. If you're looking around, it's not looking very good. But that's a very depressing topic, so I don't want to go on. I'm just saying that I know that some of the other water people, they're saying, where are our streams? Where's Cowbelly Stream? It's no longer there anymore. We should have more streams. So, water is obviously a fascinating thing to watch. Okay. depressing. You're smiling so much, I'm like, oh, that's a dangerous topic. So, well, if you guys don't have any more questions, I won't put you in any pain. So I hope I gave you something to think about. I just wanted you to think about agriculture a little bit different. I think we always kept thinking the same. And it's like, for our first 50 years, Kansas had a whole different look. And I like it because the area I'm at, I live in a small town by Lawrence. And when you read about the newspapers then, you'd go down there to the local train depot, and it was just loaded up with potatoes. They grew a ton of potatoes around me. That's how people made their living. There was berry farms all around my house, and, they were loading up tons of strawberries there. So it's like, I never thought about, trains going through Kansas, and they were loaded with produce, and they were all going to these other places. So just hoping that you think a little bit differently about it, and bye. Okay, thank you. Okay. So.
Thank you, Cindy. Our next meeting, I believe, is April 4th, and Rusty's supposed to be here, and Ron's going to talk, too, about disaster relief work. So hope to see you in April. Thank you so much for coming.
So do I have a jump drive in here? Or did you... Oh, I took it.